Alright, hello everyone. So we are at the final video of our piano arranging music theory crash course series. What a mouthful. I'll think of a nicer name if I can. And in this video we're going to be talking about texture. So texture is probably the easiest of everything we're going to be going through so far because it just involves a few intervals and a few ideas. But it's also the one that can give you the most effect, the kind of concept that's the easiest to cheat, and it's the one that I think I enjoy using the most. Now, a quick disclaimer, if you've read a bit of music theory, you may have heard of homophonic and polyphonic textures. Now, while that is the proper definition of texture, we're not really talking about that definition today, though I will briefly mention it. Now, what we're really talking about is the idea of thick and thin textures in arrangement, the modern conception of the word texture, where texture means either you've got a huge, expansive orchestral, like right in your face kind of wall of sound feeling, or you've just got this little, duet between the bass and the treble. So the first is an example of a thick texture, and the second is an example of a thin texture. And to illustrate this, I will be using the example from the rhythm video, Lily Cove City, beautiful little waltz. And let's compare some sections. Right, we'll start with this one, the opening section. Here's how it sounds. And then now listen to this part. So what you may have noticed is that halfway through this section, we suddenly got a bit bigger. The music felt a bit thicker. And that's because I just added more notes. Wow, revolutionary, isn't it? And I added more notes by adding certain notes below the melody line. What this has the effect of doing is it thickens the melody, gives it more space. It makes it take it up. It makes it take up more frequencies. Right. So in the first example, the melody line was just solo, it's just doing its own thing. Whereas in the second phrase, I added a few notes just to beef up the texture. So now there's a better example to kind of illustrate the contrast. Let's listen to this section. So we heard this really interesting contrast between these 4 bars and next 4 bars. In the first 4 bars, everything was kind of thin, right? It was just like a duet between 2 parts. And here it got a bit thicker, and here it's really quite thick, right? Because in the first example, we used octaves. And octaves can be used for a really thin effect, and I'll explain that a bit more later. But basically, they have almost the same effect as playing one note. Whereas in here, this set in this phrase, we've got a thicker texture because we filled in the harmony with a lot more notes. A lot more notes which are in the triad or in the chord, which they belong to. Whereas in here, we only had just a few notes, so double in octave. So what am I getting at? What am I getting at here? Texture is created, texture in the thick and thin sense, is created by adding more notes which are in the harmony. So let's let the idea sink in, right? We know that, every melody is accompanied by a harmony, and that harmony is generally formed out of triads, right? So to thicken the texture, right, all we need to do is fill in notes from that triad. Now, of course, if you've read a bit beyond the idea of triads, you will know that not every chord is a triad, but most of them are. And if you stick to the idea of triads, you can just fill in any note from there and you'll thicken the texture. Make it broader, make it wider, make it sound bigger. So with that in mind, let's do an example. Let's do this section. In this section, it's a very simple waltz, but the right hand plays only a single line while the left hand plays the accompaniment in full. So here's how it sounds. Now, this sounds like, a fairy floating over the water, right? Because we've got this little dainty melody at the top, while the left hand is quite robust, it's quite thick. So what if we want a thicker effect? What if we want the music to be thicker? Now, of course, we mentioned that texture can be created just by adding notes in the chord, right? And well, in the left hand here basically just highlights all the chord notes. That's how I've written it. I'll just give you a cheat there. And in essence, a lot of these are just triads. It's just that I've moved the notes around. So this is a triad on one of E major, something like that. Now, it's very simple to thicken the texture in this case, right? We can just add whatever notes in here. So for example, let's add an E below this. And then let's add a E below this as well. What notes in here? Oh, it's an E major chord as well. Okay, how about we add an E? But that's a tritone, so let's not do that, right? What about a G sharp instead? And how about an E here? How about a, oh, the chord has changed. Now we are on a B major chord. We've got D sharp, B, and F sharp. How about we add a D sharp and an F sharp here, and same chord except now we've changed a few notes around. Let's do F sharp as well. And what I'll do is I'll just play this section. And here's how it sounds already. Oh, way much. We're just way much. What a nice term. Way thicker. Can we make it even thicker though? Yeah, sure. Let's just add chord tones. So we can add a B below this because B is the chord. I can just, I'll just fill them up, Okay, let's do this. And now it sounds really thick because here's how it sounds. Now we're like in an orchestra. Right? So texture is actually pretty simple. All you need to do is fill in the notes in the chord. Now, I'll just play this for contrast. So let's say I'll just undo everything that I put in. Here's how it sounded at first. Like fairy floating over the waters. Here's how it sounded after I, did I just, okay, well, looks like I can't redo it, but that's great because now I can move on to my next point, which is, do you really want to go to every single note and then find what's in the chord and add it in? Well, I mean, it works, it sounds pretty good, but do we have shortcuts? The answer is yes. Now there are two intervals on the scale which are particularly good for doing this increased textural effect. The first is the third, and the second is sixth, which is basically a third the other way around. You can go and Google that if you're interested. So all we need to do to thicken the texture in a really quick way is to add a third below or sixth below of the melody. So let's say, just for this, I will use a shortcut that adds a third below for every single melody note. And here's how it sounds. Sounds pretty good, yeah. Now, of course, some bits sound a bit off because they're not in the chord, right? But some bits, even though they're not in the chord, they sound pretty okay. There are complex harmony rules behind this, and it's not too important. But I guess for now, what you can do is, if you intend to use thirds to thicken your texture, use your ears, right? For example, this one sounds really bad, so let's just move it to a chord tone. And now it will sound a bit better. There we go, much better already. So I also mentioned that on top of a third, we can do a sixth. And here's how the sixth sounds. I will use the same shortcut, and I'll add a sixth below every single note. Just as nice. Can we do both? Of course we can. So we'll add a third, and then we'll add a sixth. Here's how it sounds. And then you'll just have to change a few notes around, right? So that's not in the chord, we'll just get rid of that. This one sounds pretty okay. This one is a bit weird, so let's move this to the chord. This one's probably fine, but we can do this. But it's a tritone, so let's do this instead. And this one's fine, but I mean, how about we move this up? How about we move this up? And then here's how it sounds in the final product. So just by cheating, using thirds and sixths, and then moving a few notes around if your ears tell you something is off, you can get really thick texture. And they just sound pretty okay. So that's a shortcut. Use thirds or sixths. Now, very briefly, what I mentioned earlier when I was talking about this part was that octaves were basically single notes. And if we know of texture as adding harmony notes, then yeah, that kind of makes sense. Because if you add an octave, you haven't really added any harmony notes, you just added one of the same note. But what an octave does is that it makes the sound taller. Not necessarily thicker, but taller, bigger. And if I were to play just this section, here's how it sounds. Bigger and taller, but not thicker, not more robust. So how do we make this sound good? Well, there's a really interesting trick that I love to play, and that's use an octave in addition to either a third or sixth. So in this case, let's say I add a third and also an octave. Okay, this thing's a bit weird. I'll just get rid of it. Here's how it sounds with third plus octave. It gets both the tallness of the octave and the wideness of the third. And you do this with a third and a sixth and a octave and an octave. Well, of course you can. Here's how it sounds. There we go. So that's texture for you. Now, of course, these shortcuts are just shortcuts. And we have to keep in mind that texture is created by adding notes which are in harmony. So once again, while my shortcut to you is to use your ears, the real answer to this is it's all in the complex harmony rules, and you can go figure that out yourself if you like. But in essence, just to go through what we went through today, the idea of texture, at least the conception I'm looking at, deals with thinness or thickness of the music. It deals with how wide the sound is, how big it is, how in your face it is. And texture is generally created in the melody because it gives the melody more space, it gives it more strength. So if we take texture as being created by adding notes which are in harmony, then we can just add notes which are in harmony. But we have shortcuts. We can add a third or a sixth, or if we want a taller sound, an octave. And we can do a combination of thirds, sixths, and octaves to create tall, beautiful, huge sounds. Now, of course, one final disclaimer. On my channel, I talk about accessibility, and one of the things I have to balance a lot is creating big textures while still making it playable. Because in the end, I hope you intend to write arrangements which you can play yourself. So making thicker textures, of course, may sound good on playback, but can you play it? So that's always the tension I'm thinking about, and it's something that you have to consider when you're writing textures as well. But with all that in mind, we've come to the end of the series. We talked about the nature of the piano, about melody and accompaniment, a lot about harmony, and just the littlest bit about rhythm and texture. And I hope that this has been a fruitful experience for you as it has been for me, and that you can go make your own arrangements with this basic knowledge. So thank you so much for your attention throughout these 7 videos. Please feel free to send me feedback or leave me messages in the comments if you either want a more advanced harmony tutorial series or something like that, whatever you may think, any feedback at all. And once again, thank you so much for your attention. Take care everyone and stay safe. Have a wonderful week ahead.